Okay. Okay. I'm so sorry about last week. I get really bad migraines and hadn't had one in a while, and I got a really bad one the night before. And then I got this weird fever and all this weird stuff, but it wasn't COVID or anything, but I basically just didn't feel good. So I apologize about that. I knew I would make the class up, but I know some folks wouldn't be able to meet this week. I think because there's another class that meets on a Saturday. I think Dr. Hebbert's got a class that some of the folks are in. So I apologize about that. I do want to talk about the midterm real quick.
Excuse me, can I inform you on something?
Sure.
I have an 11 o'clock funeral.
Yeah.
So I will leave. I'll be leaving early, but I do need to discuss some things. So in the chat, I asked for your contact information.
Okay.
Okay. So I could discuss assignments with you.
Okay. Gotcha.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Let me talk about a couple of things before I get going. With the midterm, it's open now. It's open till Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. Rod had asked a question earlier about the timing and things like that. Technically you have 4 hours, but you don't have to do it all at once. You can start it and then stop. And every time you log out, it'll save where you're at. And then when you log back in, the time will start and it'll pick up where you left off. Don't walk away from it or not log out of it, because the time will keep going unless you log out. That doesn't happen very often. Most people finish all at once. And like I said, if you've done the study guide, you should be really fine on the midterm. The questions are like suspiciously similar, like basically the same thing. And you can use the study guide, you can use your book. I'm fine with all those things. There's only 75 questions, so it shouldn't be too bad. Quite a few folks have at least started it already. Second thing, after I graded the first APA assignment, I sent some people comments and things like that. And then with the second one, I got to thinking about it later, and I wanted to give people, I don't know. The reason I gave the assignment is so you could, if you needed to learn more about APA or how to do it, I wanted you to actually learn it. And so what I've done with the second assignment is and I'm grading those right now, I'm going through those right now this weekend. Once I give you feedback, like if you did great on it and you don't need to change anything, that's fine. But if you didn't really get it and didn't do as well as you'd like, I've given you like a second chance basically to return it in. So I'll grade it, give it back to you, and you can return it in. And I've got a place on Moodle for that. It actually says resubmit or return in or something like that, your APA number 2 assignment. Most everyone won't need that. Most everyone's done really well. But I do know that APA is different for some people. And I did that in this class specifically because sometimes this class, for some reason, is like one of the first classes that people take at Amberton. And if you've never really written an APA format, that can be kind of weird for you. And so I wanted to actually give you a chance to do the best you could on that particular assignment. So that's why that's there. You'll notice, I think it's January 29th is when so that's a week from today, you have to return that in. You should get your grades for that back with today or tomorrow. I've gotten like a third of them done, I think, already. The third thing is for the paper. I've had some folks email or contact me about the paper. And so you have, of course, February 12th is when the actual paper's due. So you have a little bit of time for that. What I want to encourage you to do is to think about the paper that you're going to turn in terms of like what developmental stage is interesting to you, or do you want to write about? And then inside of that developmental stage, is there a disorder or a situation or something, a phenomenon that happens in that stage that you want to research more? And that's what you basically write about for your paper.
Okay.
And I've written this is all in the instructions. And I talked about this the last couple of classes, but I just kind of wanted to go back over it because I know we're getting a little bit closer to the paper. So follow the template that I've given you basically with the document that describes this assignment. So it's 2 sections. The first section is the research part. There's 4 areas to answer in that part. And then the second section is the reflection part, which is basically what you think. And there's 4 questions that I've asked you to answer and go over. And then obviously the reference, you're going to cite the research that you've done. So you need 3. You can use the book as 1 reference, that's fine. But you need 3 additional references outside of the book for your paper. And that's all in the description. And I'll probably talk about this again because we're going to meet again on the 5th, February 5th. We're going to meet and I'll probably talk about it again, but I just wanted to bring it up now as we get a little bit closer. Sometimes people have questions about that. I should have this weekend everything graded. I'm a little bit behind just because I got sick, but I should be all up to date with everything this weekend. Lastly, with the exam, when you finish the exam, it'll give you your grade right there. If you missed anything, it'll tell you which one you missed. And then I get a copy. It emails me a copy of your grade as well. However, the exam site and Moodle are not connected. So when you finish the exam, you won't see a grade in the grade book yet. I manually enter the grades for the exam in the grade book. And so don't freak out if you see there's a 0 or no grade or something, you've taken the exam. It's just because I haven't manually entered it. And I won't manually do that until next weekend. So you'll know your grade because you get your grade right then. But I won't manually enter those until a little bit later. The other thing is this exam is 75 questions, it's 75 points. So you'll see a grade like 75. Don't think you made a 75%. You made a score of 75, which is actually 100%, right? You're not going to see a percent on the grade. You're going to see the actual points that you got. The reason why I say that is sometimes people look at the percent that they got and then they see a different number in the grade book and that kind of freaks people out. Just know that this is all done on points, not percentage. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. With the paper, anywhere 4 to 6 pages should be fine for the paper. This is not something that's going to be 10 or 20 pages. It shouldn't be, anything more than 6 pages. I can't imagine why it would be more than that. 4 to 6 pages should be plenty. All right. Okay. Having said that, get over here.
Excuse me, can you hear
Yep.
me, Professor?
I can.
When you said 4 to 6 pages, that is not including the cover and reference, is that correct?
That's right. 4 to 6 written pages. That's right. Yep. Any other questions about any of those things? All right. Now let's get on to what we're going to talk about today. I believe I put this PowerPoint online. Let me make sure. I think I had to move it around. Yeah, the live stream adolescent. It's got a different date, but it's the same PowerPoint that I use. It's actually on Moodle. If you want to have it, you don't have to look at it right now. It's fine. I usually just put it there just so you can see it. We're going to talk about some specific things today with adolescents in terms of just some biological factors, socio-emotional factors, and some cognitive factors. And then we're also going to talk about, from a clinical perspective, some best practices with adolescents. We'll talk about some of those things. And then we'll also have, usually as we go through this, there'll be questions that come up, which is great. You can either put those in the chat or I'll stop periodically and kind of ask, hey, are there any questions? And so that's kind of what we'll do today. And the goal of today would be to at least hit basically starting in middle school and then high school. And then I'm going to try and probably leak into college a little bit. But what we don't cover in terms of like later adolescence or young adulthood, we will pick up the next class that we meet. The next class will be a lot more of young adulthood into the rest of adulthood. We'll talk about all three phases of that. But today I want to talk about a couple of things specifically with adolescence. And when we think about that stage of development, I'm going to talk about it in a couple of different ways. But one way I like to look at it is early adolescence is really the time frame of like around sixth grade up until eighth or ninth grade. And then after that, you have middle adolescence, and middle adolescence is more maybe ninth grade, depending on when they reach puberty, but ninth grade all the way into maybe, I don't know, 19 or 20 years old. It used to be late. There was an actual late adolescent stage. It's not really called that anymore. It's now young adult or emerging adult, but that's that 20 to 26 or so stage of development. We'll talk about that last part a little bit, but most of that will be next class. What we're going to really focus on is the early and the middle. Those are the times when there's a couple of things that are happening. The first big one is puberty. My assumption would be I don't need to describe puberty to everyone because everyone here's gone through puberty or knows someone that has or knows what that is. But puberty is basically a couple of different things happening. Obviously, there's a lot of change biologically. Kids start growing more. There's usually some type of hair growth in some way. There's changes in their body. There's changes in metabolism in a lot of times. Obviously, muscle, your muscular skeletal system changes. Then there's also this kind of emergence of your sexual drive comes online. So there's a bunch of things happening at once, just biologically and physically. But there's also a lot going on mentally. Cognitive development wise, there's two times that our brains are the most active in terms of growth. And that is at the end of infancy into toddlerhood and during this middle and late stage of adolescent development. The thing that's happening with teenagers or adolescents at this stage is their brains are going crazy. There's all kinds of things that are happening. One thing is there's a pruning effect that's happening. In other words, some pathways that they had developed over time, they might no longer use those neurological pathways anymore, and they'll prune them. They'll get rid of them. Some of that's environmental. Some of that's just genetic. The other thing is new pathways will grow. Now, new pathways can grow all the time throughout our whole development, actually late into late adulthood. Pathways can grow or regrow. That's not really different, but not at the speed at which it happens in late and middle adolescence or early and middle adolescence. So there's a lot of things going on kind of all at once. And then there's a big change or big shift in, like, socially speaking, the dependence on, let's say, parents or caregivers versus the relationships that they have with friends. Their social life starts to change, where they start really pushing towards independence or autonomy. Sometimes it looks like an experimentation. Sometimes it looks like rebellion. But that kind of push towards independence is a fairly natural part of adolescent development. It's interesting that it happens then because in some ways they need adult involvement more during this stage than they ever have before. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about that. Sorry, someone's trying to get into the class. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple of those things specifically. All right, I'm going to share my screen here because I want to talk about one thing. Let me get over here. There we go. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see this. Try to make it large. Okay. I kind of just mentioned this benefit of having adults around. What I mean by that is having adults around in their life, in addition to what their parental or caregiving figures. There's a huge benefit of that, and it's ironic because during this time of their development, that's not really what they want, but it's something that they actually need. Obviously, when we've talked about like infancy and toddlerhood and then late childhood, obviously kids need parents, but they know they need them, and it's not really a big deal. They just kind of live. Adolescents need adult involvement, but they don't think they do. And it's kind of one of those things where, and this has probably happened to you, where a parent can tell their teenage kids something, whatever, some piece of wisdom, some piece of information. Have you thought about this? Try doing this, whatever that is, right? And they kind of blow you off, whatever. Another adult can say the exact same thing that you said, and they think it's like the greatest thing that's ever been said. It's like all of a sudden that person is like a genius, right? Well, that's because of this idea that they need other adults, caring adults, trusted adults in their life other than parents. There's two reasons why. The first reason is exactly what I just said. They'll listen to adults that they care and respect more so than they would maybe listen to their parents. And that's kind of important because they don't always make great decisions. They don't always think through things the right way. And they got a lot going on. They got a lot of decisions to make. And if you guys didn't know, life is a lot different now than when any of us were teenagers. Some of us, that was quite a long time ago. For some of us, maybe it wasn't a long time ago. But it's very different. The biggest difference and the biggest shift and change has really happened in the past 10 years to 15 years, really. Honestly, 2007 was a big marker. And that's when the iPhone came about. That's really when things really started changing in terms of culture, in terms of decisions, in terms of things coming at them quicker. So the biggest benefit is having caring adults in their life that they really need to kind of bounce things off of. The second thing is they need those caring adults because hopefully they can build a relationship with them that can like carry on as they continue to grow and learn and develop. Hopefully it's not like a one-time relationship. Hopefully it's something that happens for them over a longer period of time. But like I said, the irony is they don't really want that until they get it, and then they realize that they want it. Now that does change eventually. That's going to change by the time they get into their mid-20s, even their parents influence changes or becomes more helpful to them. But here's one thing that's interesting, and you can look up any research study that's been done in terms of caregiver or parental influence over their kids in the past 40 years. The answer has always been the same, that parents or caregivers are the number one influence over their kids' lives, for good or bad. They are the number one influence, which kind of makes sense because they grow up with them and they're around them all the time. It doesn't mean that they necessarily do everything they say, per se, but they are still extremely influential in their life, which is something really important to remember. Now, why do I say that? Let me talk about this clinically for a second, and then I'm going to take a step back and see if there's any questions. Clinically speaking, any of you that decide to work with teenagers or families or both or marriages, any of those things, you're going to work with some parenting at some level, which basically at this point in adolescent development is basically working on the relationship between parents and adolescent is really what you'll be doing. So the thing to remember is helping parents first understand that this is what's going on now is not what probably is going to be going on 10 years from now. Like the place that these guys are in right now is going to look drastically different in some cases 10 years from now. In other words, at 15, right, they might be, I'm making up these scenarios. They might appear, maybe they can't do anything but play video games and never come out of the room and they don't have friends. Or the opposite. They have tons of friends and they don't care about their schoolwork and they just, don't pay attention to anything. I mean, you just name the scenario, right? Almost any scenario. The odds are that when they turn 25 or 6, the odds are they'll be very different than they are right now. So I try to help parents see that what you do right now matters, because what you do right now, they will remember 10 years from now. Even though they'll be different, they'll remember those interactions. Like they remember how you handle things. They remember how that was. They specifically start to remember when they get married and start having kids, and all of a sudden you become really, really smart. I think Mark Twain's the one that said, as I got older, my parents got smarter and smarter, which is true. And that just makes sense because they're gaining wisdom, because that's how we gain wisdom over time, making mistakes, learning, that kind of thing. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I think that there's often a drive for parents to get their kids fixed with like they want us to fix their kids. And there might be something going on that they need help with. That's absolutely totally possible. So like if I was talking about this with another class, the Practicum 2 class on Thursday night, we talk about different cases and looking for help for different cases. And one of the students brought up the fact that they were dealing with I think it was a 14-year-old that was self-harming. Well, self-harming is obviously a super serious thing to work through. So parents could be bringing their kids to you, and there's legit, really hardcore things that are happening. You're going to work with them on, and you can work with the parents on. At the same time, sometimes they might bring their kids in. Maybe the kid's okay. They're going through some developmental things that are fairly normal, but the parents are having a hard time. So sometimes that therapy needs to include the parents so you can work on the whole overall system, not just one part of it. That part helps a lot too. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because sometimes helping parents to soothe their own anxieties about their kids goes a long way towards helping those relationships. Okay. And this happens a lot, clinically speaking. There's a lot of things that go on that especially if this is maybe their first teenager. You know, there's no manual about how to raise teenagers. There's books about it. There's tons of books. There's like thousands of books, but there's no manual. And you're going to make mistakes, and that's just normal. We tell our kids all the time, I'm sorry, I know I messed up somewhere. Somewhere I've messed up. I don't know where, and you'll tell me when you figure it out. But that's just what happens, right? So let me take a step back. You guys have any questions about anything that we're talking about right now? And don't forget to unmute yourself because everybody's muted right now. Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I agree with you. Definitely, I have my first teenager, and she's 13. And what we do now is very important. I have my kid around me all the time when I'm not working. So she watches me like crazy.
Oh yeah.
She gives me examples. She's like, when you turn on your music, I know you about to clean the whole house.
Yeah.
So it's very important that the decisions that we make around them and the decisions that we help them make is very important. So I just wanted to say,
yeah. And it's also important to realize that we're going to make dumb decisions sometimes, and that's okay. But they learn basically, kids learn by being told when they're young, and then they learn by action or like what they see as they get older. That's kind of but that's not a fluke thing. That's by design. That's how our brains actually work. That's how our brains develop. And that's why even in adulthood, if you work, like, for example, working with couples, when I work with a couple that have some kind of trust breaking issue that's happened, what they're basically saying is, you're saying one thing, but you're doing something else. That doing something else, like what you do and what you say matching up, that needs to happen pretty early on. And by the time we get into our adolescent stage, we can tell the difference. We might not always tell the difference in childhood. Sometimes we can, but in adolescence, it's easy. Like if we say one thing and do another, teenagers are really quick to go, that's BS. They have great BS detectors. They can do it. They can figure it out. But that's not weird. That's actually by design. And that's how our brains work.
It happens. I work in a juvenile facility, and that happens a lot.
All the time, I bet. They know.
They have trust issues already. So
right.
They're like, if you say one thing and don't do it, they're on you immediately.
Oh yeah, for sure.
They're gonna stay on you until you do exactly what you say.
Absolutely. But that's by design. That's how we develop. And that's actually a very important part of our development. Yeah, Kristen, go ahead.
So Dr. Bedard, so knowing that chemically and physically we could be, the child, not we, the child or the client could be going through something. How do you know if it's like oppositional defiant disorder versus just child being ornery, going through a typical growth stage, or is it bipolar? I mean, are there certain ages where certain diagnoses when a child can be diagnosed? I mean, is it appropriate to diagnose? Yeah. Oh, the child's 13 years old and has bipolar. I mean, is that accurate? I mean,
yeah. So I'm going to defer a couple of those things to when you take the DSM class, but I'll talk about that. I want to talk about it overall, like give kind of a 30,000 foot view of that, because that's a great question, actually. Okay. So let me answer it in two parts.
Okay.
But if it doesn't make sense, tell me, okay? Because I've got about 5 thoughts in my head, and I'm going to try to condense it down, because I think it's a really good question. It's a really good one. And as a clinician, you're going to be like running through this in your head.
Right. As you're talking, that's what I was thinking. I mean, culturally, you got to look at, socioeconomic. I mean, there's a lot of factors.
Absolutely. So let's think about this from just a couple of different standpoints. The first one is oppositional defiant disorder is an actual disorder that has to have certain criteria met over a certain amount of time. Mm-hmm. It doesn't, which means not every rebellious act is oppositional defiant disorder, right? Most typically, oppositional defiant disorder turns into a conduct disorder in adulthood, which is basically they're the same thing, which some of that's environmental, like you just said. Some of that is due to whatever their environment is. But some of it can also be caused by attachment disorders or some type of trust disorder, something trust-wise that's going on. Let me flip over to bipolar disorder. Bipolar, again, is a disorder that has to have certain criteria met over a certain amount of time in multiple areas of life, right? Both of those disorder, like basically any disorder, has to be chronic. In other words, like ongoing, not acute necessarily, but ongoing.
Okay.
Clinically significant, which means you met these criteria. That's clinical significance, right? And then the time frame is important too. Like for depressive disorder, you have to reach certain criteria over 2 weeks or something like that. With conduct disorder too, it needs to be in multiple different locations, not just at home or not just at school. Kind of like ADHD is the same way, not just at home and not just at school. It has to be in both places or all the places. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Naturally, this is where it gets confusing, I think. 98% of the time, or 98% of adolescents are going to act rebellious at some level, which is kind of on a continuum, right? There's a difference between I talked back to my teacher one time in my life and I got detention, I never did it again. That's versus I don't go to class anymore and I don't give a H what you think, whatever. You know what I mean? Like there's some continuum there, right? It's natural and part of development to push against boundaries. That's a normal part of development. In some ways, they need to push against boundaries because they also need, but when someone's pushing against a boundary, that means they're trying to figure out where the boundary is. They either don't know where it is, they don't like where it is, or they need to talk about where it is, or something like that, right? Oppositional defiant disorder, at the heart of it is really the authority piece that they really don't like, right? Bipolar disorder at the heart of it is more inside the major depressive category because it's part of a depressive disorder.
Okay.
Right. So
different categories. Okay.
Yeah. So Nicholas is where he's working with. My assumption would be in that environment, there might be a certain amount of those kids that could have been diagnosed with any kind of thing, like you name it, they could have been diagnosed with it. Some of that's environmental, some of that's because of where you work. I mean, just because of where you work. Like I worked with the adult population of juvenile. I worked with them for 3 years, and there was a few conduct disorder, but a lot of addiction, a lot of anxiety, a lot of, fill in the blank kind of things that some of them had been diagnosed with oppositional defiant. The reason why it's so confusing, this is now I'm going to slip into my opinion. Okay. So y'all just know that I'm telling you what I think based on research, experience, kind of being around the mental health world for a while. The one thing that I have seen that I think is detrimental to us as clinicians is it's now become easier to diagnose yourself or self-diagnose. And now teenagers do it a lot more. They used to not do it as much. Now they do. They'll go on and Google and they'll look up all the symptoms of something, you name it. And they'll say, this is what I have. I have bipolar disorder, or I'm bipolar, or whatever. You fill in the blank, right? And that might not necessarily be correct. So as clinicians, we have to be really sharp about what they're saying, not saying. Like we need to be able to kind of, weed through the minutia, so to speak. right? I know that's a really long answer to a short question, but those are all the things that I would think about, right? So you got categories of disorder, right? If they meet criteria, that's one thing. The way in which they say to you that, you know, I'm bipolar, or I've got, you know, whatever, that thinking through like, hey, what makes you think that? Talk to me about it. You know, that kind of thing. I've even pulled the DSM out with clients and opened it up and said, here's actually what the disorder means, and here's how you know, have that diagnosis, kind of thing. Because that's what we use. And what I'm talking about in terms of the DSM with Dr. Armstrong, you'll get into a lot more in depth. You'll talk about this a lot more in depth than I'm doing right now.
Okay.
And then the third thing is knowing that certain environments have certain risk factors, right? Certain environments are going to have risk factors that other environments don't have. It doesn't make them wrong or right. They're just risk factors, right? Low socioeconomic status, you know, kids that come out of a low socioeconomic status will have certain risk factors. High socioeconomic status has certain risk factors, and then kind of in between, right? That in terms of like your financial security, like where you are financially on the ladder, it doesn't matter. Disorders, behavior, emotion, cognition, doesn't matter where you're at. The environment does, and culturally, there's some things that matter, right? Like I've seen kids that come out of low socioeconomic status that are super well developed, great kids, super smart, great families. And then I've seen the exact opposite on the higher socioeconomic status. Really not very good parents, not very well developed. You know what I'm saying? Like that doesn't, but we have to be mindful of the risk factors that happen in each of those areas. Now that's just one part of culture too. I'm not even talking about all parts of culture. That's just one part. We could talk about it in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity. And these aren't black or white, like, you know, good or bad. I'm just talking about there's differences, right? We could talk about, which we'll talk about here in a second when we talk about the sexual piece of it. That even matters. When did you reach puberty matters. Like how quickly you mature or not mature matters. I mean, there's a lot of things that kind of go into that. Kristen, does that help? Hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not an easy answer, but yeah, no, it helped. It helped kind of guide me. Thank you.
Yeah.
If I may, I've worked with teenagers in a different capacity than Nicholas, but one of the things that has made that self-diagnosis new and different is up till about 10 years ago, any diagnosis was a stigma.
Yeah.
And so they didn't want a diagnosis. Even if they had one, they didn't want to share the diagnosis. Mm-hmm. That has completely shifted where
total opposite. It's total opposite.
A diagnosis, even self-diagnosed, gives you like social credit now.
Yep.
Like they want to be able to say I'm bipolar or I'm this, which just muddies the waters even more.
That's right. And I'll tell you what I've seen at a lunchroom table, you'll have groups of kids now that identify as something at that table together. And if you try to enter that table and you don't have that identity of and I'm not talking about gender identity, I'm talking about disorder, like any kind of thing. You can't get into that group because you don't have that thing. So it's the exact opposite of the way it used to be, right? With the adolescents in the adult world, there's still some stigmas with certain things, but in the adolescent world, it's totally different. We could do a whole TikTok. We could do a TikTok teaching on this easily and make it fun. You know what I'm saying? Like make it funny. And that's actually a good idea. I might do that. All right. Sorry. Yeah, Tom, that's to your point. You're exactly right. And that's one of the big changes that's happened just in the last 10 or 15 years, for sure.
To kind of piggyback on Tom, been working high school for good 15 years. And I too have noticed that over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, that our counselors will allow kids to leave class. Well, I'm having a rough day. And they're, of course, I keep running into a lot of kids that now abuse that, but they're, our counseling staff, or at least our school, they'll even give kids a pass of, well, you can come and see me anytime. And so,
That means anytime, right?
yeah, test day, project day, because they are extremely, well, stressed or anxious or whatever other issue they come up with. And our counseling staff really is not able to, they're not trained. Well, they're school counselors, they're not professional counselors, so they take more of what the kid says. And if they're kind of self-diagnosing, well, now they're bamboozling these adults that are there to help. And as you and Nick said, well, not only are they good BS detectors, they're even better BS deliverers.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. I think what you guys are saying is a big shift that's happened. And this shift's actually not just with teenagers. This shift is a big shift overall with people. We really went from having mental health be kind of stigmatized for a long, long time to almost flip-flopping and going the other way, that, if you have a diagnosis of major depressive disorder and you have major depressive disorder, that is really difficult to work through. Very difficult. Same thing with generalized anxiety. Same thing with bipolar disorder, and like any of the mood disorders are obviously super difficult. By nature, teenagers have a little bit of depression and a little bit of anxiety, just like adults do. We all have a little bit of that. One of the things that I have started doing with teenagers, I started doing this a while ago actually, is talking about it in terms of a continuum, like in my brain, like trying to track it in my brain. Because you guys need to know like the criteria. So let's just talk about depression for a second. If that's okay with y'all, let's talk about this clinically. You need to know the criteria of depression, and then you need to help them start to distinguish that between kind of having the blues or kind of being down, which happens to everybody. I think what needs to be normalized to me is that it's okay to be down and not have depression. Like, that's okay. Everyone's going to get down. Okay. Everyone is going to have moments of, oh shoot, they're going to be anxious about something, like whatever it is, something out of your control or something unknown, or something you're scared you can't handle, some kind of fear. Like, even if it's a small fear, that happens to everybody. That's normal, right? That's not an abnormal thing at all. But that doesn't equate to major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, or any of those mood disorders that might fit. You might have one or two of the symptoms for sure, right? Absolutely. You absolutely might have that, but you might not have the full disorder. And so sometimes helping talk about it in that way can be helpful. That's why I say, what's the difference between major depressive disorder and kind of having the blues or being down? Well, there's about 18 different criteria that are different. I mean, you got to reach all of them at a certain amount of time. That's why we have good assessments for it too. There's some really good assessments that will help assess for depression and anxiety, just like there's really good assessments now to assess for any kind of suicidal thought. I talked earlier about self-harm, which aren't necessarily always the same. But we can assess those things now too and get a really good picture of where people actually are, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm getting a little bit off track on a rabbit trail here, but this is kind of important because clinically, this is kind of where we're at right now. Like, there's going to be people coming in basically saying, I've got whatever, this thing. And they might have it. They might have that disorder, but they might not. So we need to be the ones to kind of walk through it and work through. We're still going to work with them either way. We just need to be able to know what's going on. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. Any other questions about anything we're talking about? All right. I see the reason why I stop sometimes is sometimes people flash on their video. And most of the time in my world now, when people flash a video, they're about to talk. So that's why I stop, because no one has their video on anymore, which is fine. I don't care about that. All right. Because I saw James pop on, so I thought, well, James is about to enlighten us and give us all this wisdom.
Well, that's funny you say that, because I've taught school for about 19 years. So, and I've taught every level, whether it's elementary, I've coached high school, and it's just interesting because I got a safety plan the other day for a student, and you get all this stuff and the kids are going through this, and it's almost overwhelming for the teacher in education at a point. I mean, obviously, what's going on in education right now. So,
Yeah.
no, I put my video on. I was like, just maybe people want to see me. I have no idea.
No, you're fine.
No.
I just want us to be able to talk about this
Yeah.
practically too, because there's some practicality to what we're talking about right now. I mean, the world is going right now. We're, nothing stops because we're taking a class. And COVID has had and is having, tremendous impact on all areas of life. And that's not going to go away really quickly either. So I think it's good that we talk about this. We need to have these discussions. Someone asked me if they could follow me on TikTok. I actually don't even have a TikTok. My wife's on me about this. She wants me to get one, but I don't actually have one. Teresa.
I found what I have found very disturbing when it comes to young adults, teens, that nowadays there are several quiet sufferers. They're the ones who actually are diagnosed, do have the disorder. They, for the most part, they don't say anything. They're quiet sufferers. Whereas these subcultures that have developed on the various campuses or different arenas in which they're together, the ones who make all the noise really aren't the ones who are suffering the most. Most victims I have found they reach an extent of being without voice. They lose their voice and they just kind of move around.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great point. For the most part, when we talk about depression, we don't talk about depression. Like we have depression, but we don't talk. That's not something that you're verbalizing. So a lot of times with depression, especially, you might not know someone has depression because they're not talking about it at all. And that is, again, it's a natural part of adolescence, and especially puberty, to go through a little bit of depression as you go through it. That's actually very natural and normal. So having said that, I want to transition now to what I think is very important for us to talk about, and that's how puberty comes in basically and throws a monkey wrench into all parts of someone's life, right? Not just mentally, but emotionally and socially as well. So there's a couple of things to think about when we talk about puberty. I think I have these slides. I want to make sure if I have this. Yeah, here we go. Yeah. There's a couple of things to think about. I'm going to share my screen again real quick. You guys bear with me. Okay. And again, these slides are online. You can look at them. So this came from the book. I've updated the slides actually, but a lot of the slides came from the book. So puberty can happen for girls anywhere between 9 and 11 start. So age 9 now is actually becoming more common, age 9 and 10. 100 years ago, that would not have been common, but that's where it is now. For boys, it's around 11 or 13, roughly. And those are averages for the most part. Okay, so that's kind of like timing of it. I think I have that. I might have that. Yeah, 10 to 13 for boys, 9 to 15 for girls. So there's some biological things that happen, right? Like I talked about the weight and facial chest hair, pubic hair, breast growth, the first menstrual cycle for girls, those kinds of things. And those are just biological things that happen normally and naturally. The timing of it is actually kind of matters in a lot of ways. There's a real need for even more improved health and nutrition. Some of that is because they don't want to always eat healthy and nutritious because it's just easier to eat junk and carbs and that kind of thing. Some of that's that way, but some of it's because their bodies are really need it and their brains really need it in terms of like growth and being healthy. We need it obviously all the time, but that's really when like there's all this new muscle growth, there's all this new psychological growth. I mean, there's all these things that are happening. They need the right fuel to help that growth. When we talk about the other thing that I want to mention, because I don't have it in the slides, there's also the idea of like early maturation and then late maturation, right? So for boys and girls, so a boy or a girl that matures early, let's say, that girl might have a higher boost of self-esteem then because she kind of gets more attention probably. But later that self-esteem tends to go down. For boys, it can be the opposite. They can have a little bit lower self-esteem and then later it can have a little bit more, right? So there's early and late. If a boy matures late, then that late might be sometimes could be 16, 17, 18 years old. And when we say mature, not necessarily the start of puberty, but you can have the start of puberty, but other things not happen yet. Like, especially like for boys, size and height, those things matter a lot. And so you could have a boy that starts puberty, let's say at 12 or 14, let's say, but maybe they don't grow yet. They grow a little bit, but maybe they get to be 17 or 18 and all of a sudden they've grown 6 inches. That happens too. For girls, it's a little different. Normally, the normal part of maturity, girls mature a little bit quicker than boys anyway, just normally in life. Boys eventually catch up to them, not just physically, but also mentally and emotionally. That's just something that's been going on for centuries. It's been that way. It's probably going to keep being that way. It's not right or wrong. It just is. Right. And so that doesn't mean that some boys can't mature quicker. Some can, some can't. It doesn't mean all girls are super mature. Some are, some aren't. But in general, that pattern is that girls are a little bit ahead of boys maturity wise. And that's also true as they get into high school. So those things are just kind of some things to think about. Now let's talk about it in terms of like brain change. So the fibers that connect the left and the right hemispheres of the brain really start to fire up and start to connect, which is kind of important for our life. We really need that to happen. The amygdala, which is really the seat of emotion, which is like a almond shaped little piece of our brain, way deep. Like if you put your finger on top of your head and go right straight through and kind of met it in the back and in the top and kind of met it in the middle, that's where the amygdala is. It kind of sits like if this is our prefrontal cortex and we have left and right side, the little bitty piece right in the middle is our amygdala. And a lot of times we can say, whenever someone gets angry or someone gets escalated, they pop their top. That's because that amygdala is fired up and the right and left are not talking to each other. They're going off on their own side. Typically that means sometimes the right side, which is the story creative side, has already told a story of some kind. The left side can't keep up with it, which is the logic side. And we need to be able to soothe them so they can start talking to each other a little bit. That's kind of what's happening. But with teenagers, that could happen moment by moment, second by second, depending on the day, depending on the interaction that they're having or whatever. Does that make sense? And then sometimes here's the thing. they might not even know why. And when you ask them and they say, I don't know, what's one of the things that's more frustrating to adults or parents? That phrase frustrates more people, the I don't know phrase. Does that make sense? And so sometimes they don't know because so many things have happened at once, or so many things are going on at once, that they don't know what's going on. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying that that's the rule all the time, but that could be happening. And that's because the things that are going on in their brains all the time. Plus we have quite a few distractions in our life now that keep us out of the present moment, that keep us either in the future or the past. We don't have a lot keeping us in the present, which is kind of important, which we'll talk about here in a second. All right, does that make sense? Now, all of this coincides with puberty, by the way. All this different brain activity, it all comes together and joins as one, which we need to happen. It'd been good if it was designed a little bit different so it didn't all happen at once, but it all happens at once, like one big old thing that happens. I want to talk. I can't remember if there's a couple of these things. We'll talk about this in a second. All right, let me take a step back. Any questions about that? Let's talk about sex. This is important. From a developmental standpoint, when puberty happens, the sexual awakening in a person happens, which is a normal stage of development, which means you start having sexual lustful thoughts or urges, even things like that. That starts happening. And for a kid that's obviously never happened before, and then that starts happening, that's a whole new world, right? One of the old school way of thinking about sexual, like talking about sex with kids of any kind, the old school thought was, if you talk about it with them, then what's going to happen? They're going to do it or want to do it, right? But all the research says the exact opposite. The more you talk with them about it, now we need to define talking about, but the more you have discussions with them about it, the less likely they are to engage in experimentation, the less likely they are to make kind of bad choices, that kind of thing. Okay. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because it's not that long ago that basically no one really talked about sex, like in families. It's not really been that long ago. If you grew up in a family where no one talked about sex at all, any kind, and you don't really know anything about it from your family, right? You're going to learn. It doesn't mean you don't know about it. You still learn about it. You still discover things. You still can see things. But now you can discover things in lots of different areas, not just from friends. Now you have a whole wide world of discover right in front of you all the time, right? And so the old school way of thinking, families don't talk about it. It's not that big of a deal. Let's don't talk about it, and maybe it won't happen. Well, that kind of needs to go out the window, in my opinion. We need to be talking about it. We need to be discussing it. We need to be talking about it, not as in a lecture format either, as in a discussion. Does that make sense? And the reason why I bring this up is because as clinicians, some of these topics are going to come up: drugs, sex, friends, like people they associate with, things like that, school. Those are the kind of the big topics. If you work with teenagers, those will be the big ones that will be discussed or will be talked about. And so if you personally have some taboo or some hesitation talking about sex with your clients, even with adult clients. That's something you probably need to look at and kind of work out and figure out. I'm not saying it's super comfortable all the time. It's okay for it to be uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean we don't need to talk about it, because it's a normal part. It's a normal, natural part of our development. Matter of fact, we need it to be. Otherwise, it'd be bad if it wasn't. So does that make sense? Hopefully. Any questions about that?
Not really. I don't have a question, but I mean, just on this topic, because the type of clients that I work with, is very important that we talk about sexual responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've learned to become very comfortable with talking about that, and it's actually going to help me be able to do that with my own child,
Yeah.
because I have to talk about it with the kids that I work with.
Right. And like you're bringing up, Nicholas, the thing is, certain populations of kids have more experience with sex or drugs or whatever than other populations. That's absolutely true. But the research basically says the same thing about both the populations. It's the same. We all develop the same. Now, our environments might be different, right? Culture might be different, environment might be different. All those things might be different, but developmentally, we basically develop the same. There's some nuances there, but basically our development's the same. The main reason why I bring this up is because, and this is something that even my wife and I try our best to do, because we work with teenagers for a long time. But what we try to do, and I try to do this in my clinical practice with parents as well, is I want to create a place or a spot that they will feel comfortable talking to me, even if it's uncomfortable. Even if it's a really uncomfortable conversation, we want them to feel like they can talk. And if they can't talk to me, is there another adult that they could talk to that I trust, that they trust, another person?
And I mean, I see this all the time, because I'm probably with those kids way more than my own kid. But sometimes the clinicians there at work, it's some things that the kids do not want to share with them.
Yep.
And they're embarrassed about it, whether they're working with a woman or a man, but they will share with us. And used to be they weren't supposed to share the type of things that they share with us, because they wanted to protect the kids from judgment. But because they're with us so much, we're pretty much parents. I'm a correctional officer.
Yeah.
For juvenile. So they share a lot with us, but our job is to make sure that the clinicians know what has been said, or our supervisors. So we have to document things,
Right.
to make
Yeah, and
sure
the environment you're in is on one of the extremes, right? So you're talking about massive behavioral issues that led to all these things that have happened for them, and now they're in this environment, right? And the thing is that can happen to any teenager. Not that those choices can be made by anybody at any time. That's just how it is, right? The thing that I've seen that makes the biggest difference is this idea of enough caring, respected adults in their life makes a big difference to them. Now, that doesn't mean they're always going to make great decisions all the time and be perfect. That's not what it's about. It actually is the opposite. It means when they don't, make a great decision, there's still someone there that still loves them and cares about them and will be there with them, that will walk with them. Because sometimes if they don't have that, they're going to do lots of things, say lots of things, do lots of, that's so all of those things kind of matter. But when we talk about their development, the development is basically the same regardless of ethnicity, culture. The developmental pieces are basically the same. The environments might be different, the culture might be different, the experiences might be different. But those all matter too. Those have an impact on development, but the developmental process really hasn't changed that much in forever. But the environment has changed. And I want to talk about one specific piece of our environment that has changed the most, the quickest, I think, in terms of adolescent development. Like if you think about adolescent development, like I said, kind of looking at the middle school age and then the high school age and then on into college, that kind of timeline, that hasn't really changed the timeline, but how we name it has changed. 150 years ago, the end of adolescence was more like 17 or 18. You got married and you had kids. And I mean, that was kind of how it worked. As industrialization happened, all of a sudden you got people moving to the cities, and then you got kids working longer and not getting married. We became less agrarian as a society, as a world. That's when the term adolescence came about, was back then in the early 20th century. Because basically what was happening is they found these kids that, well, they weren't, at the time they weren't kids, they were technically basically adults, but really they were kids because they weren't married, but they were working, but they weren't really in school. So what do? We start changing our school system. We change the way we educate. We start building, instead of the schoolhouse model where basically everyone went together and from 5 through 18, we're all together, or 5 through 15, really. We're all together learning. All of a sudden we start separating them by age, separating them by elementary and then junior high and then high school, or whatever variation. And then over 100 years or so, 120 years, that's been kind of the model, right? That's kind of what like our basic education system has been. Now, and there's lots of nuances of that and lots of little bitty tweaks and changes. The interesting thing is that that has actually made the adolescent process a little bit longer than it once was. But what's made it I think the most difficult to wade through is not necessarily some of those changes. It's the world in which that we live in has changed like tremendously, right? So let's think about it this way. My grandmother was 103 and she died 2 years ago, or last year in November. She was born in 1917 during the Spanish flu, the last pandemic before now. I think she was 3 when World War I ended. When she was 12 or 13, I think, a biplane came to her hometown and they offered to give people rides, and she was one of the only ones that rode. She went and rode a plane, which was a big deal back then, So that would have been in the 1920s, right? In the 1930s, she sees, the Depression, the Dust Bowl, all those things. By the time we get past World War II, all of a sudden there's a lot of changes that happen, especially technology. Technology starts to really change and really kind of take off, right? We go to the moon, our space program's crazy. And then we come to the 90s, and especially the mid 90s, and all of a sudden the internet's here, which forms of the internet had been around a little while in certain companies, but all of a sudden it's kind of, worldwide, it's everywhere. I can remember the first email account I ever got was in 1995 in college. And we thought, oh my gosh, we could talk to someone that's like not, like in another city. It was a big deal. That's all well and good. But see, that happened over time, right? Like kind of long periods of time, right? Then we get to the mid 2000s, and all of a sudden we go from, we have a phone that doesn't look like this, mostly a flip phone or something, like BlackBerry's kind of around, and the Palm is around, and you can start texting. But you had, I don't know if y'all remember the old click, 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 you know, right? You had to click a bunch of buttons to text and all that stuff. You know, you got really good at that. Then in 2007, we have the iPhone. From 2007 to now, the amount of technological changes has been astounding, mainly with the speed at which things have happened. We have the same developmental cycle, right? This whole time, but all of a sudden we've got all these things that are different around that cycle. Does that make sense? Now, why in the world am I bringing all this up? Because we'd be stupid not to know that that has an influence on our development. We have to think about it that way. Probably the biggest impact on our elongation of adolescence probably started back in that Industrial Revolution time and kind of happened over time, more than likely. But we also know now that our brains aren't fully developed until around 25. We know that. We didn't know that before. But if you think about it, 150 years ago, you had maybe one or two choices to make. Now, they might have been big choices, but should I move and go work in the city or stay on the farm? That was it. Now, how many choices do we have? Right? We want our 16-year-old or 15-year-old to decide where they want to go to college and what they want to major in, and where they want to live and how quick they can get there. And does that make sense? Like, we have infinite choices now, right? With the same brain development that we've always had, which causes some dilemmas, right? Because we're not going to make the best choices sometimes, right? Now, along the route here, we haven't even talked about social media. I'm going to talk about it here just kind of briefly. Just screen time and social media, we haven't really discussed. That's probably the thing that's changed the most in terms of influence in our world. And it started out as really an influence in the teen world. And now that's no longer true. It's an influence everywhere. That's teens, adults, whoever. Right? Does that make sense? All right, let me take a step back. Any questions about any of those things?
You made a comment several minutes ago about, cognitive development and making mistakes and all of that. One of the issues I found in public schools here over the last 8-10 years is that kids are not allowed to fail. They're not allowed to fail a test or fail a class. That, well, you need to show grace. Well, they had a good reason why they, couldn't get to school on time, why they couldn't get to class on time, why they can't turn in an assignment. And I feel like because we don't allow kids to fail at a school environment where we can kind of help teach and guide them, they don't see failures until they get out of school, maybe go to college. I don't know. I feel like that we're doing a disservice in their ability, their cognitive development, by not giving them opportunities to actually fail and provide the means to help overcome that. Okay, how do you deal with that kind of loss?
So I think, Rod, what you're bringing up is something that actually starts in childhood, not just in adolescence. So let's talk about the failure cycle. That's kind of what I'd call it. So everyone fails at something, or we don't do what we want to do, or something happens where we don't succeed in something. That's just normal. That's just part of it. For example, a toddler that can crawl, and then they're going to start walking. 100% of them are going to fall multiple times before they walk, right? And so That's just part of, it's like a natural process, right? And then from walking, they're going to talk, and then they're going to not talk well. I mean, basically, right, we have to teach them everything, right? We basically, as adults, have to teach little children how to do every single thing. Eat, go to the bathroom, walk, run, talk, share, whatever, you name it, we teach them, right? So the fundamental question that I think you're bringing up is, how do we learn? That's a big question. And if we learn through failure, then we need to be okay failing. If we don't learn through failure, then how, you know what I'm saying? Like, how do we, like, I'm talking about, let's go back earlier, right? Early on in development. For example, your example, Rod, is very interesting because there's a lot of data behind what you're saying now. There's a lot of data behind success. So if you guys read the book, if you ever have a chance, you can read the book it's called Grit. It's a really, really good read. And what she's basically saying is that it doesn't, like, she uses high school as an example. It doesn't really matter what happened. This is crazy. Look at the studies on valedictorians in high school and kids that make 70s in high school, and then track their success. Number one, it evens out over time. And number two, a lot of the kids that make 70s in high school do much better than valedictorians because of what you're saying, Rod, because they hit a wall somewhere and they don't know how to keep going. They don't realize it. Well, I messed that up. You know, I need to fix that. Now, here's the key that I would tweak to what you're saying, Rod, that I think is important. I think we need to be okay with failure. I think we need to be okay to fail. I think we need to be okay if something doesn't go right. I don't think there's any problem with that. What we don't need to be okay with is letting them just sit there. We need to then step in and say, what did we learn? How did we learn? What do we need to change? That kind of thing. I'll give you an example just from my life. So my son's inherited my inability to do math. I can't do math. I hated it. I wasn't good at it. I tried hard. You know, I just, like, especially algebra just didn't click with me. I did my best because I had to, and he's kind of struggling with it. And the other day, you know, I don't think he made a 60 on a test. And I said, how'd you do on the test? He goes, well, I don't know. I didn't know like half of it. And I said, well, you know, okay. I dropped his sister off and he and I were going to Walmart. He got back in the car because he went and got something. He goes, are you mad about that? I was like, I'm not mad about it. I think, Kate, I don't care if you don't know something. That's not the point. We don't know everything. What I want you to do is figure out how to do it. I want you to keep working towards that, right? Like, get help for it, whatever that means. Does that make sense? Like, that idea behind not just, you know, we can't let kids fail. We need to let them fail. Well, let's swing the pendulum all the way back that way. I don't know if that's great either, right? We need to kind of be in the middle somewhere because we learn best when we make mistakes, but we learn great when we make mistakes and someone helps us correct them. Like, someone helps us, like, that's when you learn, right? As a teacher, my assumption would be you guys that teach, you have great teaching opportunities when there's a mistake. Does that make sense? Like, as a coach, as a teacher, as a parent, when someone makes a mistake, that's a time to go in and teach, which is really what discipline means. The root of discipline means teaching, not you know, hardcore come down on them. Now, sometimes, but that doesn't mean we don't need structure. That doesn't mean we don't need guidelines. I'm not talking about that. But we learn best when we fail most of the time. Now, the other thing is when we fail at home, it's a little easier to kind of help versus when we fail outside of the home, right? Rod, you brought that up. Like, if you've never really struggled, let's say academically, if you've never struggled academically and you get into college is a new ball game, and all of a sudden you struggle academically, that could be a problem, right? But if you struggled with something, anything, and you've kind of overcome that struggle, and then you have another struggle, you already know in the back of your mind what? Well, I've already done this once. I know I can do it. I'm going to do it again. Does that make sense? Might be a different struggle, right? But it's something that you've done once. And I think that's maybe what we're missing most, to me, which is really resilience. It's a little bit of confidence, but a lot of it's resilience. Like, how in the world did you do it? Like, how did you figure that out? How are you able to go from getting this 50 and all of a sudden you got an 80? How did you do that? Does that make sense? Those to me are opportunities. And what I'm talking about right now is clinically that's how I do things. I'm more kind of on the resilience. I do not like, I'm not a big fan of everybody should pass, or I'm not a fan of that. At the same time, I'm also a fan of, if someone doesn't pass us, let's help them figure out how to do it, not us tell them what to do. Which I think is kind of what you're saying, Rod, too. Let's help them figure it out, not us tell them, kind of what to do, if that makes sense. So, Teresa, you had your hand up for a while. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I attended, my sisters and I, we attended a boarding school, which was also a lab school, where your professors literally wrote your textbooks. And the way we attended school was, in high school, was by contract. They had figured out that you fail forward, a failing forward program. You signed you had a learning coach. And it wasn't just a school counselor. You had learning and teaching coaches, because we also had student teachers that worked there as well. But what they would do is they would have, they would take an assessment. You would take an assessment, you'd sit down and you'd go through a communication, just back and forth, to see where you were, where your interest lies, that sort of thing, and your strengths and weaknesses that they were able to see academically prior to high school. And then they would ask you, how do you think you would do in this class? And because you had a level 5, level 4, level 3, level 2. In the real world, academically, that's A, B, C. But if you signed and said, listen, I am able to do level 4 work, I'm not really comfortable with this class, but I want to learn how to do it. And the counselor says, okay, if you are able to successfully do a level 3, you'll get an A. All right. Now, there was a time in those sessions or quarters or semesters, however your school classified them, where you could do a contract change and either increase your level or decrease your level, so that you would always fail forward. And it was in this process, because I can't do math either, but I would always do my homework. One of my professors, as I moved into college, discovered I'm dyslexic. My grades were terrible, like 0 GPA. But once someone took the time and looked at my learning style and saw where my interests were, and didn't look at me as a failure, but something that someone they would work with and reteach.
Right.
They taught me how to learn.
Right.
And my grades shot up. But not only did they shoot up, I started enjoying learning.
Right. Well, it wasn't a struggle for you anymore.
It is a struggle. No, it is a struggle.
But I
just learned that you have to learn the discipline.
But it was a different struggle. It's a different struggle when you have that type of learning disability, that type of struggle, versus knowing that you have it, right? It's totally different. It's still a struggle, like you said, which I think is okay. It's okay to struggle. There's nothing wrong with that, right? At all. I think what's interesting, something that you just said that I think is really important as we think about this stage, but also as clinicians. If you look at people, just in general, if you look at people in a negative way, a cynical way, that's how you'll be clinically. if you look at people in a positive way, not perfect and not positive as in like everything's great and they're fine, not like that. I'm talking about just, hey, you know what? They've got potential. This person has potential. In other words, if I've got a 16-year-old sitting in front of me, right? Or I'm on the phone with them, because I've got an 18-year-old right now that I'm doing this with. I'm not talking to an 18-year-old. I'm talking to a 30-year-old or a 25-year-old, right? I'm talking to someone that's not going to be 18 always. They're going to be, even the next year, they're going to be different. If you look at people that have potential, then you will be a clinician like that. Or does that make sense? And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because some days that's really difficult clinically. The reason why I love this class, I love lifespan development class, is because it teaches us that where you are developmentally is not where you're going to be. You're just there right now. You're going to be somewhere else. You're just there right now. We need to live where they're going to be, not where they are. Does that make sense? Which, as a parent, when you work with parents, that's hard for parents to do. Parents are always in the moment, in the present. And that's why if you can help them see, I remember when the last youth ministry job I was at, I had a mom it was a family my wife and I were really close to. And she had a 20, I think he was like 20 at the time or 21 or something, kind of lost and kind of didn't know what he was doing. And came from the family that the mom and dad were really highly educated, very successful, all these things. And they were great. And they weren't mean parents. They were super helpful with him, but she was like, oh my gosh, I don't know if he's going to make it. And I said, you know what? He's only 20. Just, give him some time. Well, he's now like super successful, married, has kids. And she contacted me. Now, this has been long. This is like 20 years ago that discussion happened. About 10 years later, she contacted me and said, you know what? I'm so glad you said that. And it doesn't have anything to do with me. It's whatever your mindset is what's important. And clinically speaking, our mindset matters. Does that make sense? Lifespan development teaches us that this is not where someone is going to be. This is just where they are right now.
Exactly. It's like when you teach your child to walk. Some get a little spanking when they fall, and some get picked up and say, come on, you did, that was great. Now let's do it again and do it a little bit better.
Right. Yeah, we have chances to do those things with people. And I think that some of those things used to naturally happen, and now we have to be more intentional about it. I do want to spend about 10 minutes talking about this last idea of social media and screen time, but I'm not going to just talk about it today. I'm going to actually talk about it next class too, because it actually has influence, all over the whole kind of gamut of folks that we work with. I think this guy's like 35-year-old this week contact me and said, well, XYZ happened. And I kind of looked online and I think I might have blah, blah, blah. I can't remember everything he said. And he's like 35-year-old. Well, it's kind of like what Tom was saying earlier. I mean, teenagers can do that really easily. They can diagnose themselves. If WebMD says it, then this is, what's happening. So let me talk real briefly about a couple of these things, and I'm going to give you guys just a little bit of information. And I want to encourage you to read a little bit about social media's effect. There's starting to be more research out about it now. I'm not anti-social media. I'm not anti-screen. I'm not anti-video games. I think all those things are fine. There's some real, like we're on Zoom right now, right? And we communicate through electronically. So there's some great upsides to technology. It's great. I don't have any problem with technology. I'm not an early adopter, but I'm fairly close to an early adopter with most things technology-wise. I'm a big fan of it. At the same time, I'm also a big fan of balance and boundaries and trying to know how to do that. And I think what's happened with social media more than anything is it's kind of thrown our balance off kilter a little bit. For example, we know right now that companies like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, all the companies that have things like TikTok, which is TikTok hasn't been bought by anybody. They're their own, still their own folks that created it. Snapchat. There's some new, excuse me. There's some newer ones out there, and there's ones that come and go all the time that kind of get bought and changed and all that. Instagram. We know for a fact that over the last 15 years, 10 to 15 years, those companies have started hiring behavioral psychologists to work for their companies. Now, why in the world would they do that? Because they know that those folks know how the reward system works in our brain, right? Behaviorally, it's pretty simple, really. We all know how it works, right? If you do something, you get a reward. You do it again, you get a reward. You do it again, you get a reward. Or you do something bad, you get a negative, impact of it, right? So basically, that's how they develop their systems, games, platforms, whatever. It's basically to engage the reward system of our brain, because that's how our brains are wired, to give us reward, and that's kind of how we function. Deep down in our reptilian brain, that's how we function. And they know that, and that's what they've created, right? They've created basically, excessive dopamine kind of hitting us all the time, which is kind of the pleasure neurotransmitter. What that does is it kind of throws us off balance, cognitively and chemically, throws us off balance. It doesn't throw us off balance like with one use necessarily. Like if you take a hit of meth or watch a TikTok, that's not the same thing. Meth is extremely addictive, and addictive sometimes one-time shot, you can become addicted. Same thing with heroin. If you watch TikTok or if you're on Facebook, it's not necessarily the same, or play a video game. However, they play a long game with these platforms. The long game is get them do a little bit, and all of a sudden you're kind of doing it all the time, right? Same thing with notifications. If any of you at any point in this class, just like I did, got a notification on your screen, what'd you do? You looked at it. Or on your screen on your computer, you looked at it. Why? Because that's what we do. We look at it. But that doesn't mean we're going to follow through with it and totally divert our attention. But that's just, that again, is something that our brains do, right? So I think when we think about this cognitively in terms of development, there's a lot of things that are happening cognitively that really starts to impact adolescent brains at a really kind of a foundational level. That's why it's really difficult, if you've ever had a teenager, boy or girl, that is really into video games, to get them to not play video games. It's very difficult because in our family, we call it video game brain. It's really an overabundance of dopamine is what it is. It's basically you need to detox from the experience of whatever you're experiencing. So for example, we do no video games during the week for our kids at all. And they can play during the weekends, and they have a certain amount of time. And the reason we did that is because we noticed that, and I've noticed this in clients too, in my teenage clients. If you take them away from it for about a week, 10 days, all of a sudden their brains reset, and there's some different things that are happening for them, and it's kind of a different person. Same thing with adults. I've actually advised clients in the past 5 or 6 years to stop watching the news and stop getting it on your phone, and taking basically a social media break. And it's amazing what happens. It's not because we should be anti something. It's because we need to be pro something. We need to be pro balance, because that's how our brains work. Just exactly like if I had a client, and I've had clients like this. I had a client one time that came to me because they were having trouble sleeping. Some negative thoughts, but mainly sleeping was the big issue. And the more we talked, I began to figure out that this person drank 3 or 4, 2 liters of Dr. Pepper every day. 2 liters. It worked instead of water because he had a really manual labor job. Well, that's like about 2 weeks worth of caffeine that was just going through his system all the time. We couldn't sleep because he had so much caffeine. So we talked about that, right? We said, well, we need to step down off that, right? We need to, hey, can we kick that back to 2 liters a day? And then can we kick it back to 1? Or like, how can we stair step down so we can help? It's the same thing with any like a video game or a social media or sugar can be the same, or nicotine. Obviously there's different levels of that type of, it's not necessarily a full on addiction, but it's pretty darn close to what it is. Matter of fact, the World Health Organization has given criteria for video game addiction. There's actually a criteria and an assessment. We don't recognize it in America yet, but I think we will. We don't recognize it in America yet because most of the video games come from where? Here. We produce them. So there's a powerful lobby against that, if I'm just being honest. But it's pretty easy to see when we talk about it. The reason why I'm bringing it up is because cognitively, development-wise, adults have to become teenagers' prefrontal cortex. We have to do it because they can't do it. Their brains aren't developed enough to do it, and it's just too hard for them. I'm not saying they can't do it. It's just really difficult for them. So we have to set those boundaries up for them. And they're going to push against them and not like it. And this is going to happen in your clinical work. You're going to be meeting with teenagers and they're going to tell you how long they play video games, and they might play 30 to 60 hours a week. Some of them. That's a lot. That's a lot. So that kind of thing are just things to think about. I'm going to talk about this, not just now, but I'm going to talk about this in the next class too, because there's a different thing that happens with adults when we talk about like social media and screen time and things like that. It used to be really more of a kind of a teenage thing. It's really not anymore. It's matter of fact, the reason why Facebook bought Instagram is because Facebook was starting to lose a key demographic from their platform. They were losing 12 to 22-year-old girls. And what's Instagram's main demographic? 12 to 22-year-old girls. So what did Facebook do? They bought Instagram. So that's their main demographic. And it's not rocket science, it's business. They're not here to help us. They're here to make money. I mean, that's what they do. Now they help us. You know, there's great things about the platforms too, but let's just keep those things in mind as we work with people, because that really does make a difference. I've read a lot of research now recently about like all the social media stuff and their screen times. And there's a psychiatrist, she wrote an article, and she actually now requires all of her incoming patients to take, she calls it fasting, media fast and social media fast. And it's a requirement of her new patients, teens and adults, doesn't matter who. Then she does her evaluation, which is kind of fascinating if you think about it. So, and I think that model is actually a very fascinating model. To some people, that would seem really extreme. That's just kind of one way that she does it. She writes she has a very compelling argument. We didn't have a lot of research about this up until recently. We have quite a bit more now. You can find some really good research out there now in peer-reviewed journals about screen time and social media, video games, that kind of thing. So it's a very fascinating thing if you ever want it. I will warn you, it's a rabbit hole. If you dive into it, there's a lot of stuff out there. And some of it's not great either. There's some stuff out there that's kind of kooky. You kind of have to be mindful of that. But anyway, I wanted to bring that up because that's just, clinically speaking, that's part of our culture now. It's not going away. It's just part of our culture. So
I found that a fair number of my students have been pushing back. My youth and adolescents class that I took last term, the textbook said that the average kid, middle school, high school, averages 11 and a half hours a day of screen time.
Yep.
And with COVID, our school is pushing us to go more digital.
Yep.
And so therefore the kids are on this, on more screen time. Every class, 90 minutes, they're online.
Right.
And starting last semester, I started offering, well, instead of you can do it digitally or you can do it on paper. And more of my students have been, well, hey, I want to do it on paper.
Yeah.
Because they too are they're feeling overwhelmed with all the technology, all the on-screen time that they're getting. And I found it interesting in our textbook where they talked about the lack of creativity.
Yep.
That all with the video games and all the other technologies, our imagination is going down, where that's a key component for, again, cognitive development.
And mainly the reason why is there's a strong correlation between imagination and creativity and boredom. Being bored generally it's highly correlated with creativity. And we don't have a lot of boredom right now in our world. We have more things that keep us inside the house than get us outside the house, right? Especially right now. So to your point though, with the technology in terms of learning, there's a big difference between having to do a Zoom class or take a class online and playing a video game. Those are two opposite things, right? One of them causes an enormous amount of dopamine hit to our brain that we want to do. One of them is the exact opposite. It's dreaded. We don't want to do it. We don't want to be part of it, right? So those are two different things that are happening. But to your point, we've increased screen time. It's also important to remember what type of screen time we're talking about. That matters too. Because there's some biological things that happen in terms of like blue light, like we're doing right now. This is all blue light. It's technically a stimulant to our brains, not a massive stimulant, but it stimulates us versus if you've got a phone that can go into night mode or dark mode or one of those that turns the blue light to orange or red. When you get orange or red light, that's not a stimulant to our brain. It actually signals our brain to start shutting down. And that's just part of our natural circadian rhythm. So we didn't have recorded sleep problems in our world until the invent of the light bulb. The light bulb meant what? We could be up longer than sunset and not have candles. You know what I'm saying? So there's a lot of things that have happened to us that biologically happen to us. And so that's another recommendation that's always out there is, don't, stop your screen time, especially blue light screen time, at least 2 hours before you go to bed, that kind of thing, because that blue light is kind of a stimulus to our brain, kind of keeps us up. But what do we do if we wake up in the middle of the night? We get our phone. Yeah, we check it out. We read, whatever. Yeah, Tom.
I was just going to say, kind of funny on that. So we take our youth group to Colorado to climb a mountain during the summer. So obviously no phones, no tech.
Trek? You go to Trek?
Yeah. And so no phones, no light bulbs. And it's really funny. The kids that normally are up every night till 2, 3 in the morning are like, oh my goodness, I cannot go to bed before that. I cannot go to bed before that. By day 3, 8 p.m., they're like, well, nothing else to do. I'm going to go to bed.
Yeah.
And by day 4, they're falling asleep at 8 p.m. because they're like, okay, well,
there's biological and cognitive reasons that's happening for sure. Yeah, treks are great. That's fun. It's a lot of fun. All right. Hey, well, I'm gonna shut it down here. I'm gonna stop here. Next time we meet, we're gonna pick up here with kind of the emerging adulthood, and then we're gonna work our way into older adulthood. And it'll be on the 5th. I think it's the 5th. I feel like it's February 5th. I think it's in 2 weeks. I'll send a message out about it. In terms of the exam, just remember that you can, when you log in, the time starts and you can start answering questions. When you log out, the time stops and it'll save your results right there and then pick back up when you log back in. So be mindful of that. I should have all of your, everything you've turned in up until this point back to you by Sunday, by tomorrow. So you'll have all those things. And then keeping in mind that I manually enter the grades for the exam. So if you look on the grade book and see a 0 or nothing, don't freak out. I just haven't put the grade in yet. All right. All right. You guys have a good rest of the weekend, and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you, sir.
too. I'm
Thank
gonna, email you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Y'all have a great day.
See you guys.
Yep. Thank you very much.